interview questions on TADAT linkages, and how it all comes together. Welcome to this session on TADAT linkages, in which our guest speaker, Mr. Gordon Hawks, will discuss the concept of vertical and horizontal linkages and how it aligns with the TADAT methodology. Starting off, can you define for our audience the broad concept of organizational linkages, both vertical and horizontal, and how it provides insights into organizational complexity?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe before I start, what I can do is provide some context around my career. I was with the Canada Revenue Agency for 37 years, so I understand tax administration quite intimately. And out of those 37 years, I was a program evaluator for 25 years. And what I learned early on in my program evaluation career is that when you look at a program, those programs don't operate in isolation. And we found that when we went in to look at a program to determine its effectiveness and its effectiveness in achieving agency objectives, we found that it was impacted by other programs. And in fact, some of the activities or some of the inputs of that particular program were established by other programs, and that program then had to pick up that workload and deal with that workload in meeting its mandate. And then in undertaking its activities, it would oftentimes pass on their outputs to another part of the organization to ultimately achieve the outcome. Now, that might sound a bit nebulous, so I want to try to put this into maybe context of government organizations generally. Now, generally government organizations are structured following a functional model, and this creates a series of specialist groupings or enclaves across the organization, each of which plays to their own strength and to their own outputs. So if we can imagine that we're dealing with an X-type government organization, it might have a policy shop. It might have an enforcement or an investigation shop. It has a customer service area. It may have an accounts receivable or accounts payable or something similar to those. And when you look at that organization and it's in the achievement of its outcomes, you have to look across each of those areas. And that's what we mean by linkages. So for example, the policy shop sets the policy for the enforcement area. And so the enforcement area then takes that policy and applies that policy in enforcing the legislation or the policy that has been established by the organization. And then that enforcement activity may in fact result in some customer service activities. So as you can see, as no man is an island, no organization is an island. And these organizations are established in these many silos, but the importance of the organization in achieving its outcome is in fact how it works across those silos, how it works within those linkages or associations or interconnectedness. And that is really what it comes down to when you're looking at the determination of the effectiveness of an organization, just how strong those associations are, or just how strong those linkages are.
In your experience, how would the linkages concept apply to tax administrations, and can you provide some illustrative examples?
Yeah, so now we're in my bailiwick. This is the area that excites me the most. When we look at an organization as tax administration, we look at it on the basis that it has more or less four tax compliance pillars. We've got filing, we've got reporting, we've got registration, and we've got payment. And most organizations are, in fact, tax administrations are in fact structured with those silos. And so to get an understanding of how the linkages work within a tax administration, let's take, for example, registration. We register organizations for multiple purposes. So we get all kinds of information from the registrant. We get their name, then we get their address, we get their birth date if they're individuals, we get the type of business if they're a business, how large a business they are, how many officers they're comprised of, who those officers are, etc. Why do we get all that information? Well, we get that information because it's necessary to the other aspects or the other components of the tax administration. The filing part of the organization needs that information in order to know who they're sending filing information to, where they are, and in fact, what kind of information needs to be sent. Similarly, when we're trying to determine risk within the audit community, within the reporting, with respect to reporting, we need to know What kind of business is it? Can we get a really good risk profile of those businesses to really help direct where we're using our audit resources? And similarly with payment, we need to know, who are we sending the refund checks to? Or alternatively, how do we get the money from individuals in order to ensure that we've got payment compliance? And that's just one component part. That's just the front end registration. If we were to look at, for example, reporting compliance, auditors are really good at going out and raising assessments, and that's fantastic. That really has a positive compliance impact. However, we need those funds to be collected by someone. And that's the collections component or the payment component of the organization. It is dependent on being able to collect the money that was assessed by the auditors. If we go and assess amounts against individuals or businesses, but have no means of collecting that amount, we are in a situation where we're not doing the organization full service. We're not getting the full bang for the buck. So this goes to show within a tax administration, just the complexity and the importance of those associations and linkages. There is no one part of tax administration that can, unto itself, achieve the outcome of the organization. It's all those component parts interrelating to each other that ultimately allows that tax administration to achieve its compliance objectives.
How did you discover the importance and relevance of linkages through your use of TADAT methodology? Do you have some examples?
Well, this is where I'm going to tell you a bit of a story. Back in 2017, the Canada Revenue Agency had a new commissioner. And that commissioner had heard words bantied about the worth and the importance and the world-class standards that this organization was achieving. And he wanted to know just to what extent were we world-class. You know, we were banting about this term that we were world-class tax administration, and we've been saying it for 30 years, yet we had no solid evidence. We had not done any deep dive study to determine the extent to which we were world-class. So we used the TADAT as a foundational piece to allow us to get a sense of just how well we're performing as a tax administration. And the whole notion of using the TADAT was very interesting at a certain level. It was a good audit tool. It allowed us to get a good sense of, okay, we've got certain good indicators in place that are solid indicators for good performance. It's almost like we were able, if we make the analogy, it's like a doctor and a patient. The TADAT is the doctor, and the patient is the tax administration. And the patient comes into the doctor to get his physical, his annual physical. And the doctor looks at the patient and he checks his blood pressure, checks his temperature, checks his respirations, draws some blood, does a weight test, does a number of these other tests. And the doctor concludes that the patient has high blood pressure. And so the doctor could prescribe medication for blood pressure to alleviate the blood pressure problem or symptom. But really, the doctor was wise enough to sit back and say, you've got high blood pressure, but we also notice that you're sedentary. You have a sedentary lifestyle, and you're 20 pounds overweight. So if we were to address these other things, we wouldn't necessarily have to address the issue of your high blood pressure with medication. And this is like the TADAT. The TADAT, when we applied it, gave us a whole sense of things that where we weren't necessarily performing well. The takeaway was, do we address those aspects in isolation? Or were they symptoms of a larger problem? And so we started to pull back the onion, and we looked at the areas where we were getting our D scores. And some of the D scores were in areas like the timeliness of dispute resolution and the size and age of our debt, and a few other things around the whole idea of having a compliance strategy. When we started to pull back this onion, we started to realize that disputes resolution, the timeliness of disputes resolution was not necessarily the problem of the area responsible for disputes resolution. And in fact, when we peeled back that onion, we started to realize, well, where were the disputes coming from? And why were they coming from those areas? And so we started to get a sense now that, look, it's not this disputes problem. It could be a problem with how auditors are interacting with clients. And when they leave the audit, they're just saying, well, if you don't like the results of the audit, you can appeal. And that could then affect the inventory of the disputes resolution process. Similarly, when auditors go out and raise their assessments, they're not necessarily looking at making a determination of whether those amounts can be collected. That's somebody else's responsibility. My responsibility is just to assess the person for the amount they owe. And in fact, those amounts may not be collectible. So what that contributes to is a growing debt and an aging debt. So now we are starting to get a big picture of some of these problems within the tax administration. And now it wasn't just a matter of treating the symptoms. We could start to treat the disease. We could start to say, you know what one of the major problems here is we've got a lack of horizontality across those silos. We have a lack of awareness of what we're doing within our silos and the impact that we might have on another part of the organization. So instead of looking exclusively at those particular areas, we were now able to look at the organization holistically and really start to bring some value added by addressing more the disease than the symptoms.
To what extent can tax administrations use the linkages approach and TADAT assessment results to prioritize and sequence their reform activities?
Exactly. And I think, the biggest thing here is that if it worked well for the CRA, it can work well for all tax administrations. And it can help to focus really quite specifically on the broader implications or the broader problems or the systemic problems within an organization. The TADAT is very good. It's a great tool. It's a great audit tool. But when we start to bring in the linkages part of the TADAT, we now make the TADAT tool an effective evaluative tool. We now can really start to focus on the areas where reform is necessary. We can now focus intelligently with informed data in a way that really allows us to fully take the value of this standardized, replicable diagnostic tool, and really bring the powers of that diagnostic tool to bear on the tax administration. So for example, we might say, we have all kinds of problems within the organization. Some of those problems are with respect to, say, for example, our risk assessment within audit. And we have some problems within our payment compliance. When we start to peel back the onion, that onion starts to show that the problem really resides in the area of registration. We aren't getting the right information at the front end to allow us to do our back end jobs effectively. And so what we now need to do is say, is this the area that needs the reform as opposed to the area within audit or reporting or within the area of payment or within the area of filing or within these other areas? It gives us that truly informed perspective of where the problem, the bigger problems, the holistic problems, the systemic problems exist within the organization. And so when we map together the results of the TADAT with a deep dive into the linkages, we now have a tool that can help both developing tax administrations in developing countries as well as developed tax administrations who do have a lot of these same problems in a way that's intelligent, informed, and will in fact pay big dividends. The Canada Revenue Agency, as a result of the assessment we did, really took hold of the results of the TADAT, really took hold of the results of the linkages from the TADAT, and really then started to move forward with more of a holistic approach to dealing with the problems within the organization.
What are your thoughts on how this important and probably very nascent concept can be propagated more strongly and widely?
Yeah, I think the IMF has an opportunity. And I think they're taking this opportunity because this is what we're talking about today. It's that whole idea of the linkages. Taking the TADAT, marrying it with the linkages, and now we have a tool which is greater than the sum of its parts. It now brings that a whole new value to an organization. And I think, the TADAT is really good as a tool for developing countries. It's an excellent tool. But once we start to bring in the linkages component, it now becomes a super tool. It now becomes a super diagnostic tool that brings that value more broadly to the organization. And I really do believe that this is where we've got to propagate. We've got to make it clearer to other tax administrations to really understand the value of the TADAT in conjunction with the linkages, to show them what they're missing, to show them the value that it can have. And then once we have this, the next biggest step is for these tax administrations to start sharing this information together. How did I benefit from this? What did I look at? What did I find? How did I change it? Does it have results? Does it have positive results? Can you, tax administration in X country, benefit from what I just did? Of course they can. And then we start this communication. We start this communication all around a simple use of a diagnostic tool where we've added on to it and then shared the benefits of doing it. And then started that conversation. And then we now have a much more, a tax administration that is more universal and benefiting universally from what others are doing.
And here comes a question that we'd like your views on. Are tax administrations being managed or operating in a holistic manner?
I have to smile. My knee-jerk reaction on this is no. Even the best tax administrations, I think, are suffering from vertical malaise. And that is with respect to the vertical silos that they operate within. And it really is, because I'll use the Canada Revenue Agency as an example. We have recognized the issue of horizontality within our organization for over 20 years. We have recognized that there are issues with the functional model. So we have recognized that we have issues in operating holistically. And that's largely because these silos report to outputs. These silos don't have, they work against almost that collaborative effort to work horizontally to outcomes. So we need, and I think this is again where we can benefit from a tool like the TADAT in association with an understanding and a deep dive into linkages to really better manage our tax administrations, to better and more holistically manage our tax administrations. And it's really interesting because when we did the TADAT, we did not do a standardized TADAT performance assessment report. We followed the TADAT in the conduct of the diagnostics, but we did not follow the performance assessment report standards. We really wanted to get a sense of what were the real problems within the organization. We really wanted to get a sense of what were these results meaning for us, meaning for the Canada Revenue Agency. And so we wanted to really get a better understanding of what were the systemic issues that the TADAT was identifying so that we could address those systemic issues. So this is where I say, I think most tax administrations suffer from this vertical siloed malaise, and that the TADAT and with the association of the linkages with building that component part of linkages can really help break down those silos to really help manage the organizations or allow organizations to manage more horizontally in the achievement of their ultimate outcomes.
Any other comments on this very interesting subject?
It is an interesting subject, and I think it's groundbreaking. I really do believe it's groundbreaking, and I do believe the IMF and the TADAT Secretariat has embraced this. I really believe that this does take the TADAT from an audit tool, which is an important tool, to an evaluative tool that help organizations truly determine the effectiveness and to what their and a review of their effectiveness and to really benefit these organizations to improve, to be more holistic, and ultimately to be more holistic, you've got a better outcome. And it's not only a better outcome from the tax administration, it's a better outcome for the population you're serving. If you're ensuring that you've got compliance, you're ensuring that you're bringing in the right amount of revenue to support the social infrastructure, the social and economic infrastructure of the country. So this is why I get very excited. I get very excited about when we talk about this topic, because I think it is groundbreaking. I think it is one of those areas where I think we can start to make some major impacts on tax administration generally. And if we look at some of the countries around the world, and I won't necessarily name names, we know that there are countries that are ahead of the game, and we know that there are developing countries that are way behind. And if we start to use this universal tool, and if we start to take this universal approach, we bring each other along and we make ourselves better. And in doing so, we make our countries better, we make our countries stronger, and I think ultimately everybody benefits.
Thank you very much, Gordon, for sharing your experience and insights into what is clearly an important topic. Next time, we should talk about how to apply the ecosystem approach to managing taxpayer compliance.